The Draft Ivory Act 2018, Meaning of Ivory and Miscellaneous Amendments Regulations 2024.
I call Minister Craig to move the motion.
I beg to move that the committee consider the Ivory Act 2018, Meaning of Ivory and Miscellaneous Amendments Regulations 2024. And can I begin, Mrs Harris, by saying what a joy it is to serve under your chairwomanship today, and how great it is to see you. This instrument amends the Ivory Act 2018 to extend the prohibition against stealing an ivory from an elephant to include ivory from the following 4 magnificent species: common hippopotamus, killer whale, narwhal and sperm whale. Walrus was included in the original consultation but was later removed following a further analysis of the Windsor framework implications. However, this SI does not include walrus, as it will continue to be protected under existing regulations on the trade in seal products. The UK is committed to protecting these species whose conservation status may be threatened by the trade in their ivory. All 4 species are listed under the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, CITES, which regulates their trade internationally. Hippopotamus and sperm whale are listed as vulnerable on the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Red List. That's the IUCN Red List. This instrument seeks to help conserve populations of the 4 additional species. The Act will prohibit commercial activities concerning trade in their ivories in the UK. This will prevent transactions involving items made of ivory from these species contributing to markets which create a demand for ivory, driving poaching and the illegal trade in ivory. Extending the ban to these 4 species will also make compliance and enforcement of the Act simpler and more effective and reduce opportunities for laundering ivy. It sends a strong signal that ivory should not be seen as a commodity for financial gain or a status symbol. There are 9 prescribed institutions who support government in this important work: the Ashmolean Museum of Art and Archaeology at Oxford, Glasgow Life Museums, the Horniman Museum Gardens, Manchester Museum, the University of Manchester, National Maritime Museum, National Museum Scotland, the Royal Armouries, University of Cambridge Museums and Botanic Gardens, and the V&A Victoria and Albert Museum here in London. This instrument amends Scheduled 1, prescribed institutions, to the Ivory Prohibitions, Exemptions, Process and Procedure Regulations 2022 to correct the names of some of the aforementioned institutions prescribed under the Act. Finally, this instrument amends the Ivory Prohibition (civil sanctions) Regulations 2022 to make consistent the references to service of notices relating to civil sanctions. I commend the draft regulations to the House as the Whip taps his pen.
The question is that the committee is consider the Draft Ivory Act 2018, Meaning of Ivory and Miscellaneous Amendments Regulations 2024. I call Shadow Minister Dr Hudson.
Thank you, Mrs Harris. It's a great privilege, Mrs Harris, to serve under your chairship today. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Minister for bringing forward these important regulations to committee today. I am very happy to say that we, His Majesty's most loyal opposition, are very supportive of this instrument. Animal welfare and protecting and conserving precious animals and wildlife across our planet is something that unites us in humanity. Indeed, we Conservatives are extremely proud of the Ivory Act 2018 that this SI builds upon, an act which we introduced which received widespread support across both houses. This builds on our strong Conservative record on animal welfare, including in the last Parliament the Animal Welfare Sentience Act, creating the vital Animal Sentience Committee that evaluates new legislation with due regard to animal welfare. The Animal Welfare Sentencing Act in 2021 introduced tougher sentences for animal cruelty, and I was delighted to help and support the puppy smuggling bill 2 weeks ago, a bill started under the Conservatives, and I'm pleased to see it carried forward by this new government. The SI before us today was introduced by the Conservatives earlier this year, and I'm again pleased that the government has picked up the Conservative baton on this. To expand the Ivory Act to 4 further species to try and stamp out the horrific trade in tusks or teeth is something that we need to unite behind. As a veterinary surgeon and scientist, I'm in absolute awe of these animals, such as the elephant, the hippopotamus, and marine mammals like orcas, narwhal, and sperm whales. Incredibly intelligent and beautiful animals with complex familial, behavioural, and social interactions. They categorically must be protected, Mrs. Harris, and any hunting or killing of these animals is just horrific and barbaric. It is therefore right that this SI expands the scope for ivory covered under the Ivory Act to encompass these other precious and majestic animals, to give the same protections so that their ivory will not be traded. Extending the Ivory Act will ensure that we in the UK are world leaders in prohibiting this trade and encourages conservation of these animals. I'm pleased that the UK can set a global example that we will play no part in facilitating the modern ivory trade. While we are very, very supportive of this instrument, I do have a couple of clarification questions for the Minister that I hope she might be able to help us with. Firstly, something that has been raised is the impact that this might have on museum collections, such as natural history collections. Can the Minister give assurances that they will still be able to hold and sometimes move, if need be, pieces, in some cases, that are potentially hundreds of years old? What other countries have followed this approach, and what have happened to their museum collections? And what other plans does the Labour government have to use our global soft power to help countries combat poaching and the ivory trade and the trade in hunting animals? What steps will the government take to support and collaborate with allies on an international scale to stop poaching? I note the Minister mentioned the walrus, which was included in the original consultation and was taken out of this SI because the walrus is covered in separate sealed products legislation. Can the government, however, keep a watching brief on that to make sure that that sealed products legislation covers the ivory from walruses as well, and in need be come back and add to this SI if that is not working, because you'd hate to have a majestic creature like the walrus slip through some loophole. So I hope that the government can keep a review on that moving forward. On an allied theme, as I've pressed this government before, not least in a major debate last week in Westminster Hall, I hope the Minister can confirm that the government will uphold the previous Conservative government's position and use every opportunity to be a global leader on this in putting pressure on countries who hunt some of these precious animals, to advocate for an end to cetacean hunts in the Faroe Islands, and also with whaling still tragically and horrifically practiced in various countries, including Norway and Japan. Can the DEFRA Minister outline how the government is approaching countries that still conduct whaling, and what steps in international discussions and negotiations the UK is taking to help end this horrific practice? Mrs. Harris, there is no humane way to kill a whale, and this horrific practice must stop. Can the Minister reassure this House that the new Labour government will continue to have the UK playing its part on the world stage to end whaling once and for all? In closing, we're very happy to support this statutory instrument to ensure that we can play our part in protecting these wonderful sentient creatures. By extending legislation to protect these 4 further species, we are sending out a strong message from the United Kingdom that any trade in ivory is completely horrific and unacceptable.
Minister Craig.
What did you want?
Sorry, Testament.
Thank you, Mrs. Harrison. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I wondered if I might actually reiterate the request for walrus. I understand that it is protected by the Seals Protection Act, but I wanted to be really clear that there are some loopholes in that act, and whether there could be some government monitoring of both the online and physical trade, for example in auction houses, and making sure that that it confers equivalent protections for the walrus. The second species I'd like to raise is the warthog. The warthog is not CITES listed, but its teeth are traded, and it is in declining numbers, and this needs to be carefully monitored. It's on the red list for the International Union of Conservation of Nature, and although it's not at serious risk of extinction, I would urge the government, please, to look at protecting the warthog equally, because its teeth are traded. Otherwise, we're really very happy to support this, and it's been a very long time coming, and I'm glad that this government is bringing this forward. I would finally just point out that, of course, the puppy smuggling bill is supported by the government, but was actually brought in by my colleague, the MP for Winchester. So, thank you.
Minister Craig.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Harris. Well, let me begin with the warthog, because I didn't think I had anything to say. on the warthog, but I do indeed have something to say on the warthog. The 2021, thanks to my excellent officials who have travelled down from York today. So the 2021 consultation set out options on extending the Act to species that may face threats to their conservation status, which may be exacerbated by the threat from the trade in their ivory. Neither species of warthog are listed under the CITES Convention, so they're not under CITES, and they are both classified as species of least concern on the IUCN Nature Red List. So yeah, please come back if you.
Thank you. I'd ask the Minister to recognise nonetheless that they are in declining numbers and they are on the red list. So it is. I'm very happy to discuss this with her later. But I just want to make sure that we watch our warthogs. I can give the honourable lady an undertaking to watch our warthogs. Right, very happy to continue the dialogue. I would like to thank her for raising her points today. As described earlier, extending the Act to these 4 species demonstrates UK leadership. It makes the existing ban more effective and adds protections for 4 species. It's part of a comprehensive package of UK leadership to tackle the illegal wildlife trade and reduce poverty, including, to the honourable gentleman's point, through our Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund, which has allocated £57 million to 173 projects in 60 countries. These projects are reducing demand for illegal wildlife products, strengthening law enforcement, establishing effective legal frameworks, and promoting sustainable livelihoods. And I think it's important that we say that when there is trade in illegal wildlife products, there is often trade in other illegal goods. Usually these gangs do not content themselves with the pillaging of our abundant natural world. Let me turn now to walrus and why it wasn't included. Walrus, under the seal products regulation, which have been carried over from the European Union, seal products including walrus ivory, can only be imported and placed on the UK market for sale in limited circumstances and subject to strict conditions. You can only bring seal and walrus products into Great Britain if they qualify under the Inuit and other indigenous communities exemption, because obviously, particularly in the Canadian Arctic, they are important sources of HoC cash income for those Arctic communities. And if they have a seal catch certificate, this is an attestation document which provides the item is exempt and the seal products are certified as coming from a traditional hunt carried out by Inuit or other indigenous communities and contributes to the subsistence of the community and considers the welfare of the animal. I'm afraid on the museums... Can I just... I'm going to... Yes. Can I... Yes.
Just can the Minister give undertakings that the government will keep a watching brief on walrus if need be, put it back into this statutory instrument if there are loopholes created?
I undertake that watching brief. I will give exemption. I just want to talk about the musical instruments. I'm very happy to write to him on the issue of musical instruments and on the issue, but that's about the trade in ivory and what's going on.
Government whip.
Yeah, we're going to have to come back.
Can I move the vote?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So let's just do the vote.
Yeah.
Come back.
Yeah, we're going to suspend. We suspend till 5:20.
To be given 15 minutes plus 10 minutes for a change.
5:20.
17-22. We'll resume with the Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs Harris. Let me just say a couple of sentences, because otherwise it's embarrassing. So can I just talk a little bit about global leadership? So we're determined to protect these species whose conservation status may be threatened by the trade in their ivory. That's why we're determined to move forward with this instrument as soon as possible, recognising our long-standing support of strengthening the ban on ivory sales and ensuring the UK is seen as a global leader in animal conservation. In future, these 4 species will be afforded the same protections that already exist for elephants, and my officials have already commenced work on the online ivory registration service to add to these species. I just want to let the committee know about a little bit about the species, because at the moment the UK is a net exporter of ivory from these 4 species, which fuels the global demand market for their ivories. And if I can just detain the committee for a minute to say that the hippopotamus species, we had 20 imports into the UK in the years between 2013 and 2022, and 29 exports from the UK. But for the other 3 species, killer whale, we had 1 export, narwhal, we had 20 exports, sperm whale, we had 103 exports. So even under the ban, we were still exporting these, and this fuels the trade. So I think this is an important loophole that we are trying to close here today. Now, a number of countries have introduced ivory bans and closed their domestic markets for ivory. These include China, the USA, both at federal and state level bans. The EU has introduced guidance to member states, and Singapore has also introduced a ban. So I really think that, as the honourable gentleman said, the UK has led and will continue to lead the way on conservation of these magnificent animals. On walrus, I do undertake, as with the warthogs, to keep it under constant review. And just to his point on whaling, we strongly oppose the hunting of all cetaceans other than limited activities by Indigenous people for clearly defined subsistence needs. The UK has reaffirmed its strong support for the global moratorium on commercial whaling at the September International Whaling Commission meeting, with the Danish government in attendance, where we co-sponsored a resolution on international legal obligations in commercial whaling. We also raised the UK opposition to cetacean hunting at official level in September as part of the UK Faroe Islands Fisheries Intersessional meeting, which took place on the 3rd of December. Ministers and senior officials will continue to raise the issue with the Faroese at every appropriate opportunity.
Will the Minister give way?
Very happy.
I think Testament you asked first.
Yeah.
Okay.
Testament.
Thank you. I'm reassured in part. I still would be delighted if we could look further at walrus. I don't understand why we would not protect the walrus and the warthog, because by closing off the trade in those 4 species you've mentioned, it might enhance the desire for people to start to hunt in those other 2 species, the walrus and the warthog. And I don't quite understand the logic of not protecting them, because there's nothing lost by protecting these particular species.
I thank you for that intervention. So walrus was included in the original consultation, but was later removed following further analysis of the Windsor framework implications. So this is to do with the EU application in Northern Ireland. We're committed to implementing the Windsor framework in good faith and to protecting the UK internal market. But you know, so it is protected under the seal products regulations, and seal products, including walrus ivory, as I've said earlier, can only be imported and placed on the UK market for sale in limited circumstances and subject to strict conditions. But I'm sure if we go back to the consultation response, we will see that we'll be able to get the figures. And if not, I do undertake to write to her with the actual numbers on the imports and exports of these products, if indeed they are... so the existing rules for walrus ivory, so seal products can only be brought into Great Britain to sell if they qualify under the Inuit and other indigenous communities exemption and have a seal catch certificate. This is an attestation document which provides the item is exempt and the seal products are certified as coming from a traditional hunt carried out for the subsistence of the community, as I said earlier, and which considers the welfare of the animal. So I do hope, but I'm happy to...
The warthogs?
And the warthogs, I've said all I have to say on the warthogs earlier. Mrs Harris, I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Shadow Minister.
I thank the Minister for giving way again, and thank you for the clarifications about walrus. And again, her undertaking, if she could write to me as well, in terms of keeping a watching brief, if there is a loophole that could be exploited in terms of the seal products legislation, and if need be, to come back to this House to amend this statutory instrument to actually stipulate the the ivory from these animals to come into this form. So if they can keep a watching brief on the in and out of the country, because I just worry that some unscrupulous people may well try and exploit these unintended consequences. In terms of her comments about whaling, I'm very grateful for her for clarifying that ministers in dialogue with the Faroe Islands actually raise this at high level. Can she, though, I did ask a wider question, that in wider discussions, whether they are fisheries negotiations with the Faroe Islands or Norway, or indeed trade negotiations with countries like Japan, that the UK will have a world leadership role in putting pressures on these countries to stop this horrific practice of whaling. Can she give that undertaking in her department, but also other departments like the Trade Department and the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office as well? Thank you.
Minister.
I thank him for that point, and I can say that we have committed to ensure that future trade agreements ensure the very highest animal welfare standards, and that was certainly not always the case under previous trade agreements. I just wanted to come back on his question to me about museums, if I may. So I mentioned in my opening speech prescribed institutions which provide advice to the Secretary of State via the APHA, the Animal Plant and Health Agency, on whether an exemption certification should be granted for items that are pre-1918 and of outstandingly high artistic, cultural or historical value. And there are these 5 exemptions to the ban which apply to all species, and this is why I started on with musical instruments. So musical instruments made before 1975 with less than 20% ivory by volume, items made before the 3rd of March 1947 with less than 10% ivory by volume, portrait miniatures made before 1918 with a total surface area of no more than 320 square centimetres, items which a qualifying museum intends to buy or hire, and items made before 1918 that are of outstandingly high artistic, cultural or historical value. So I think we have to remember that there was a time when ivory was regularly laid on piano keyboards, was regularly used for the inlay on violins, and was regularly, for example, used in gaming dice and things like that. So these historical things, you think about the famous walrus chess people in the British Museum, these are sort of treasures. And of course, if we are doing exchanges with other cultural institutions, we have to allow those pieces to travel, but under very, very strict, permitted and certified exemptions. So these items can be bought, sold or hired out only if they meet one of the 5 exemptions to the ivory ban, and they have to be registered or certified under the relevant exemption using the digital ivory service.
Give away one last time? I'm very grateful for the Minister for giving away. My question actually wasn't focusing down the pathway that she's talking about in terms of musical instruments. I was actually referring to natural history collections, but I'm assuming her answer is relevant to that as well. But she's answered about musical instruments. I was focusing on the natural history collections.
Minister.
Fascinating question. I mean, you go to see the birds exhibition at the Natural History Museum and you see a case full of hummingbirds and you wonder how many of them are still alive in the wild. I don't know the answer to that question, but I will undertake to reply and write to you. So with that, Mrs Harris and committee, I hope I've addressed the issues raised across all quarters. and may the warthog sleep safely tonight. And I do hope that the House will approve this instrument. I'd like to thank the committee for their support and their diligence in returning, and I commend these draft regulations to the committee.
The question is that the committee has considered the draft Ivory Act 2018, meaning of Ivory and miscellaneous amendments, regulations 2024. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order.